set, number 23, S237.
Senator Housakos.
I move this bill in my name, Madam Speaker.
It is moved by the Honourable Senator Housakos, seconded by the Honourable Senator Wells, that this bill be read a second time. On debate, Senator Housakos.
Merci, Madame Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
It's very apropos that after all the questions regarding foreign influence on the debate on S233 and the good questions from Senator Kutcher, it's now we'll be dealing with a little bit more regarding an issue in terms of foreign influence in our institutions. And there's, of course, many ways that foreign entities can influence our institutions in our country. Colleagues, I rise to speak to Bill S237, which would amend Canada's criminal code and establish the foreign registry for entities and individuals that seek to influence Canadian policy in Canada's democratic institutions and processes on behalf of identified foreign regimes. Foreign interference and influence is not new, but with the advancement of technology and information sharing, it is becoming more pervasive and is likely being used as a tool by authoritarian regimes. In this regard, the occurrence of this is increasing and thus making it a growing threat. Canada's intelligence agencies have long been warning about this threat of malign foreign influence to our democracy and our society. Several reports have outlined these warnings, including the 2019 CSIS public report released on May 20th, 2020, and the 2019 annual report of the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. The 2019 CSIS report states that espionage and foreign influence activities are directed at Canadian entities both inside and outside Canada and are direct threats to Canada's national security and strategic interests. It goes on to warn of the vulnerability of democratic institutions and processes, including our elections. Furthermore, according to an issues note prepared for March 24, 2021 committee appearance by Minister of Public Safety Bill Blair, and I quote him, "Through its mandate to investigate threats to security of Canada, CSIS has seen multiple instances of foreign states targeting Canadian institutions and communities. The scope of potential foreign interference activities can be broad, encompassing a range of techniques that are familiar to intelligence agencies. These include human intelligence operations, the use of state-sponsored or foreign influence media, and the use of sophisticated cyber tools." End of quote. Colleagues, we have all witnessed and many of us have voiced concerns about the impacts of foreign interference and influence on our democracy and our foreign and domestic policy. This is not a partisan issue. On the contrary, and the truth is, if we don't start addressing it in a meaningful way, it will absolutely erode public trust in our elected officials and our processes and institutions. I know there certainly was a lot of talk about foreign involvement in the recent Freedom Convoy, in particular about foreign financing, something that was actually not borne out during committee hearings in the other place. Some have also expressed concern about foreign involvement and funding of other protests, including all manner of illegal blockades in Canada. Leaving aside the particular political agendas of different activist groups, I know from the tweets and public statements of many of my colleagues, the issues of foreign interference and influence concerns you as much as it does those of us on this side of the chamber. I hope that means, in addition to your always thoughtful reflection on all legislation that comes before this chamber, that I can also count on your support for this particular bill as it seeks to remedy something for which we've all expressed concern about. Foreign influence and interference is real, and it is very much happening right here in Canada. In many cases, it can be financial, and in other cases, it comes in the form of disinformation, sometimes both. And in the worst cases, those acting on behalf of foreign regimes have intimidated and even threatened Canadians and others on Canadian soil, or threatened their loved ones back home, in order to silence them or influence their actions, including how they vote in our elections. And while we already have laws in Canada to deal with some aspects of these coercive actions, such as removal of persons by the Canadian Border Service Agency and penalties under the Elections Act, there is far more that can be done, and it should be done. And no, the answer isn't in ourselves chipping away at our freedoms and democratic processes and institutions. The last thing we should do to fight foreign disinformation, for example, is to limit free speech. That is not to say we shouldn't reject the promulgation of foreign propaganda from our airwaves like we recently did with Russian state-controlled broadcaster RT or Russia Today. But it is a very different beast than censorship of our own citizens. We should not seek to emulate the tyrannical regimes against who we are attempting to guard by silencing our own citizens. And that is why I was troubled to learn of Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly's comments at a House committee last week in which she testified regarding foreign propaganda. And I quote, "And our mandate and my mandate as foreign minister is really to counter propaganda online. Social media companies need to do more. They need to make sure that they recognize that states have jurisdictions over them, that they're not technological platforms, that they're content producers. And it is our way collectively to make sure that we can really be able to have strong democracies in the future, because this war is being fought with 21st century tools, including social media," end of quote. Colleagues, while I'm happy to hear this government express concern over foreign interference, I'm less than comforted by Minister Joly's comments. The first job of any foreign minister is to defend the national interest and the values we hold as Canadians, which include free speech. So I repeat, the answer to combating foreign interference isn't to censor our own citizens. Instead, the Foreign Influence Registry and Accountability Act will force greater transparency by exposing those who do seek to influence on behalf of foreign regimes, our policies, public debate, and decision-making, by identifying those acting in the interest of a foreign entity rather than in Canada's interest. We introduce a measure of accountability for both those agents and the officials who receive them. Why shouldn't we have such a registry? Do Canadians not deserve to know who is lobbying their public officials on behalf of foreign entities? This is no different, really, than the lobbyist registry. The Lobbying Act recognizes that free and open access to government is an important matter of public interest and that the lobbying public office holders is a legitimate activity. The registry this bill proposes is no different. It recognizes that lobbying by foreign entities and individuals as a matter of public interest and benefit to Canada is a legitimate activity. However, the Lobbying Act also recognizes that Canadians and even public office holders themselves should be able to know who is engaged in these lobbying activities. And the very same can and should be said about those lobbying public office holders on behalf of foreign entities. I would argue that on that principle alone, this legislation should be passed without hesitation. Colleagues, transparency, openness, and public accountability are vital elements in Canada's democratic process. And we shouldn't abandon those principles in our effort to combat foreign interference in our affairs. And this bill does just that. For those of you unconvinced of the need of such a registry, and others who will make the argument that this legislation and any such registry would or is meant to target one particular entity or one particular group of people, allow me to further make my case. From the Government of Canada's own website, again from that issue's note prepared for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Minister of Public Safety, Bill Blair's appearance at committee, and I quote, "Threat to Canada's national security, such as foreign interference and espionage, can harm multiple areas of our society. They can have impacts on our democracy processes, our economic prosperity, our critical infrastructure, and even members of our communities." It goes on to say, CSIS has observed persistent and sophisticated state-sponsored threat activity for many years now, and they continue to see a rise in frequency and sophistication of this threat activity, end of quote. This note, available to read on the Government of Canada Public Safety website, goes on to describe the nature of the activities. And I quote, "Canada has observed state sponsorship information manipulation employed by certain regimes aimed at reshaping or undermining the rules-based international order. These states are manipulating information, including employing disinformation, to sow doubt, discredit democratic responses, and erode confidence in values of democracy and human rights. It is important to note that this information originating from anywhere in the world can have serious consequences, including threats to the safety and security of Canadians, erosion of our trust in our democratic institutions, and confusion about government policy and notices. State-sponsored disinformation campaigns are an example of foreign interference," end of quote. Honourable colleagues, some of that was in reference to our response to COVID-19, but CSIS does equally warn of the threat more broadly. And in an effort to counter foreign interference in the 2019 federal election, the government created SITE Task Force, which stands for Security and Intelligence Threats to Elections. So concerned was our government with electoral interference that they did this. And it's not good enough to only be concerned with this when you think it negatively affects your chosen outcome. We have heard a lot about alleged Russian collusion. We're in favor of the Donald Trump in the United States. But the issue of foreign interference is much broader. What I believe we face is a deeper systemic challenge related to foreign interference by authoritarian states. We need to look no further here in Canada than what happened in our most recent federal election with, amongst others, the author of this bill, the predecessor bill, and former Member of Parliament, Mr. Kenny Chiu. Mr. Chiu lost his seat in the 2021 election in large part because of disinformation campaign about his bill, a disinformation campaign that was clearly linked to a foreign power. Writing in the journal Policy Options in January, Susie Fung Lee and Benjamin Fung noted that the tactics used against Mr. Chiu were indicative of foreign interference, and they said, quote, "These tactics could be deployed against any group in any information and psychological warfare campaign." Imagine Mr. Chiu introduced legislation aimed at curbing the very thing to which he fell victim to. Elaborating on their findings, Ms. Lee and Mr. Fung noted that the use of fake news is widespread in diaspora communities via social media apps like WeChat and WhatsApp. They point to research that indicates people tend to accept misinformation as fact if it comes from a credible and trustworthy source, and that feelings of trust can also be based on feelings of familiarity. Ms. Lee and Mr. Fung wrote, "The reliance on internet information often results in the creation of an echo chamber that is further exasperated by the filter effect of the online algorithm. Applications such as WeChat Moment, a feature in WeChat, which is widely used by the Chinese community, similar to Facebook and Instagram, allows individuals to view others' stories. Thus, the Chinese community is being trapped in the vicious cycle of reinforced information consumption patterns." End of quote. The authors of this article highlight that Beijing was able to use Mr. Chiu's pro-democracy, anti-communism activism, and his vocal criticism of Beijing's atrocious human rights record to depict him and his bill as radically discriminatory against the Chinese. They were successful in categorizing the bill's primary objective as being one of suppressing pro-China opinion, and perhaps most troubling to many in the Chinese diaspora community, as a means to surveil organizations and individuals in the community right here in Canada. Colleagues, we will never know if this campaign of disinformation alone is what ultimately cost Mr. Chiu his seat in the Greater Vancouver area. But there is no denying that it occurred, and that it, at least in some part, played a role, or very well could have played a role, in him losing his seat. And that's cause enough for concern. Whether it was the primary cause for Mr. Chiu's defeat or not is immaterial. The fact that we must take steps to ensure against it happening in the first place, to Mr. Chiu or anybody else. Our colleague Senator Wu will no doubt take just as much exception to this bill as he did with Mr. Chiu's original bill. Senator Wu has been quite vocal in questioning the validity of the argument of foreign interference. He has asserted that the attacks on Mr. Chiu may simply have been indicative of a debate within the Chinese community. In his opinion piece in Policy Options from January of this year, our colleague Senator Wu takes issue with the idea behind Mr. Chiu's bill because many Chinese entities could theoretically be subject to direction from the Chinese state because they operate from a territory of that authoritarian state. Well, yes, Senator Wu, that is precisely the point. The reality is that an authoritarian system, an entity that is based on such a state, could indeed be acting as an instrument of that state. In my view, just because the investigation and the management of this problem is complicated by the web of influence and control that an authoritarian state possesses, does not mean that we should not take action to protect ourselves. I would argue that regardless of the challenges, is that it is imperative that we take action. And no, that does not mean that Mr. Chiu's legislation or mine is an attempt to single out any one group of people. And I think it is highly irresponsible and dangerous for anyone, much less a holder of high public office, to make such a claim. An example of the disinformation campaign that was perpetrated on Mr. Chu comes from a WeChat post claiming that his bill's predecessor, this bill's predecessor, would have had extremely negative consequences for immigrants from mainland China. It claimed, quite obviously falsely, that the bill would automatically harm economic, cultural, and technological exchanges between Canada and China. The post goes on to claim that because the bill was undoubtedly targeting mainland Chinese associations, perhaps the most egregious of the claims about this bill was that the bill aims to control and monitor mainland China's speech and behavior. Colleagues, that's just ludicrous and ridiculous. I think all of us here can understand just how ridiculous it is. Unfortunately, Senator Wu reiterated and attempted to further legitimize this false narrative in his opinion piece, going so far as to suggest that exchanges between a Canadian member of a Chinese cultural group and a senator may be subject to a registry. Colleagues, that is an absolute misrepresentation of the purpose of this bill, and also a misrepresentation as to what a registry would look like in practice. This bill is not attempting to target or single out China or Canada's Chinese diaspora. Far from it. What this bill is about is understanding the nature of foreign involvement and potential interference by authoritarian regimes in Canada. I believe that we must take the steps needed to try to better understand and address the challenges represented by such entities in our nation. Nobody, least of all yours truly, is suggesting that foreign interference in our democratic institutions, policies, and processes is limited to just one actor. Far from it. The communist regime of China is just one example of that state that are most certainly engaged in such practices. It's well known, it's understood, it's accepted, recognized. I've also mentioned Russia. We can't observe what occurred in the United States and then claim we're somehow immune to the same influence and interference. In the lead up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there is no question that information warfare played a key part in Russia's state strategy. Part of that campaign has been to manipulate and shape international opinion. In this regard, we need to understand that Russia's intervention in Ukraine did not begin in 2022. It began years earlier, and Russia's parallel disinformation campaign has been an integral element of Russia's state strategy. And if we're speaking about Russia, we must also consider Iran. According to a study out of Simon Fraser University School of Communication, Russia and Iran appear to have been the most active in targeting Canada with disinformation. Simon Fraser professor Ahmed Al-Rawi bases his arguments to this effect on analysis he has carried out of tweets identified by Twitter as coming from Russian and Iranian state actors. These were posted between 2010 and 2019. Professor Al-Rawi calls the campaign of disinformation repeated and systemic. In a Toronto Star article last year discussing the study, Professor Al-Rawi said that he had seen tweets by Iranian trolls written in French falsely linking former Prime Minister Stephen Harper to ISIS ahead of the 2019 election. He'd also seen Russian trolls falsely suggesting that the man who killed 6 people in a Quebec City mosque in 2017 is innocent. Then there are the memes of Justin Trudeau, hundreds of them. The Star points out memes that the author points out are sexist and include photoshopped images of our Prime Minister wearing headscarves paired with Islamophobic messages. Professor Al-Rawi calls this micro-targeting that has the objective of sowing division in Canadian society and mobilizing certain groups. In some instances, these tweets promote certain positions about events that were happening outside Canada, including as early as in 2014 at the time of Russia's annexation of Crimea. We continue to see such campaigns now related to disinformation around the invasion of Ukraine. This is not a partisan issue, colleagues. This is a matter that should be of grave concern for all of us as parliamentarians and as Canadians. And it's not just disinformation with which we need to be concerned. Members of various diaspora communities right here in Canada have anecdotal evidence of overt threats and attempts to intimidate being carried out within their own communities. The objective has been to attempt to dissuade people from voting or from speaking out against the regime or being activists, which we take for granted in our democracy. Canadians are often threatened right here, not only with their own safety, but also with the safety of their loved ones back home in order to achieve the desired effects. If there are activists for human rights, they are told that if they continue to speak out, their parents or a brother or a sister back home will pay the price. And these aren't idle threats, colleagues. Often the message is delivered or reinforced through a phone call with their loved one who may have just received a visit from authorities. Ruki Turdush, a Canadian Uyghur activist, described Chinese police making videos of their visits, which could then be played for their Canadian relatives. And then they're not even covert about it anymore. They're very overt, as we recently saw the threats against the chief executive of Hong Kong Watch, Benedict Rogers. Using the draconian national security law, Mr. Rogers was threatened with a large fine and imprisonment by Chinese authorities because his activism against the communist regime and standing up for the people of Hong Kong. If they're that brazen with someone who has such a high public office, colleague, imagine the tactics and threats they will employ against others. Other countries engage in similar practices. Take the case of Javid Soleimani. Mr. Soleimani's wife was among the 85 Canadian citizens and permanent residents who were murdered on January 8, 2020 by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard when they indiscriminately and unapologetically shut down Ukraine Airlines flight PS 752. After speaking out about the murder of his wife and so many others by the IRGC, Mr. Soleimani started receiving messages stating that the IRGC was aware of his activities and they would target him anywhere, and that he would have been, must be careful. Imagine facing those kind of threats and intimidations on Canadian soil. Mr. Soleimani reported the incidents to the police, but says that not enough has been done to alleviate the growing fears of Iranian Canadians. Mr. Soleimani told the media conference in late 2020, and I quote, "One day Canada was the safest place for all of us to live, but currently it's not all that safe." End of quote. From that same press conference, the Canadian press detailed the story of Shimi Lamo, a University of Toronto student who recalled a harrowing tale of harassment to which she was subject when she ran for student government in 2019. Ms. Lamo spoke of the thousands of messages she received that included threats of rape and murder directed at her and her loved ones. Ms. Lamo brought these messages, as well as reports being followed on campus, to various law enforcement, including Campus Police, Toronto Police, RCMP, CSIS. But ultimately, as Ms. Lamo stated, "I still do not have a physical piece of paper that says, here's a report that we did, or here's the information on the people that have been threatening to kill you on Canadian soil." End of quote. Honourable colleagues, this is happening right here on Canadian soil to Canadian citizens. It's happening in our communities, on our university campuses, throughout our institutions. And we must do something to address it. Colleagues, I don't profess that this bill is a cure-all. But in terms of seeking to better catalog foreign attempts to influence our political leaders and our institutions, I believe that it can be an important first step. I also build on what was previously proposed by former MP Chu and incorporates an amendment to the Criminal Code to also strengthen our ability to hold accountable those who do not respect our laws and indeed not respect our democratic system. But what this bill does not do, colleagues, is target one group of people or target new Canadians coming to this country. New Canadians are looking for a better life. They are often looking to leave behind the oppression that was endemic in the country which they left. They're looking to ensure that the oppression they left behind does not follow them to these shores. In that regard, this bill seeks to ensure that everyone in Canada can pursue their dreams and live their lives free from threats and free from intimidation. This bill has widespread support from Canadians. A NANOS poll conducted last year showed that 88% of Canadians surveyed supported the passage of a Foreign Agent Registration Act to combat foreign influence. The call for foreign agent registry also comes from a wide array of civil society, community groups, including Canada Hong Kong Link, Central Eastern European Council of Canada, Saskatchewan Stands with Hong Kong, Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project, Vancouver Society in Support of Democratic Movement, and the Council of Iranian Canadians. Colleagues, at a time when all the world's democracies face an unprecedented threat, Canada must take firm measures, similar to the legislation that has already been enacted by many of our democracies and allies, such as Australia and the United States. This bill will provide transparency. It will give us an important tool to better protect our democratic order against the attempts being made to potentially subvert that same order. I strongly urge you to support this bill in order to strengthen or protect our democracy and to protect our democratic institutions and to protect freedom and to protect democracy. Thank you, colleagues.
We have many questioners. Senator Lankin, followed by Senator Beam, followed by Senator Wu.
Well, I think there may be some controversy here. I want to say that I truly appreciate your speech, Senator. I think in addition to Senator Simon's speech, that this is an important moment in the Senate, laser focusing on this. I want to ask you two questions. You said you didn't think that the registry was a silver bullet. I would like you to explain how the registry would work and how that would help. Embedded in that question is an understanding of how some of this foreign influence takes place, and that people are not always obvious and names could not always be added to a registry. And secondly, if there was a criticism, I'm going to have a third. Secondly, if there was a criticism of your bill, what would you think it would be? Where could it be improved? And lastly, is there something this Senate can do beyond passing your bill or amending your bill to bring a greater focus to this issue? Is there a joint project that we should be engaging in? Thank you very much.
Senator Housakos.
Thank you, Senator Lankin. The primary role of this bill is very simple, that if you have any entities, any organizations that are state-sponsored or connected with some of these tyrannical regimes, authoritarian regimes around the world that are operating in Canada, and there are many that get directly and indirectly subsidized. They work under the veil of being intellectual institutions or research centers, or very often they're not even very veiled. They're state-run, multinational, international corporations that are directly affiliated with some of these authoritarian regimes. And I think that this registry very simply states that anytime any one of these organizations, entities, corporations that act to influence government officials, politicians, MPs, senators, senior bureaucrats, they try to influence public policy, they try to, or any one of these organizations try to intimidate, directly or indirectly, office holders or Canadian citizens, they would face the full thrust of the law. Of course, this bill also amends the criminal code, adding some very stiff financial penalties, jail terms for those that are found guilty of breaking the law in this particular case, as it states. And if there's any weakness to this bill, I don't think there is any weakness. As we all know, laws are fluid in this country. We put them forward with the best intention, and I believe this will be a great first giant step forward. And as we go along and become more vigilant, because I think the number one challenge facing all democracies, including Canada, is authoritarianism around the world. And unfortunately, countries like China, countries like Iran, and countries like Russia, we have evidence to show that they're very active right now within our borders, within various institutions, and according to reports, we have to take action. I think this is the first giant step forward, quite frankly. I think it's badly needed, and I think it would be the right thing to do at this juncture.
Senator Beam.
Would Senator Housakos take a question? Senator, thank you very much for your comments. And near the end of your comments, you referred to both the United States and Australia as having foreign agent registry type legislation. In the case of the Americans, it goes back to 1938, so definitely pre-internet, leaflets, newspapers, that sort of thing. Australia, 2018, so much more recent. And the Australian legislation also has a component in it that would require any former cabinet minister who acts on behalf of a foreign entity to register or face sanctions, and in both cases there are sanctions there. I'm wondering to what extent, as you put this forward, you've been influenced by these two bits of legislation from other countries, given that there's much consideration going on in other jurisdictions, particularly Europe at this time as well, to look at ways and means.
Senator Housakos.
I have looked at the Australian model. I find that it's a lot more rigid than what we're proposing over here. Again, I did not want to go outside of the realm of public office holders and public officials in this particular instance. I'm very cognizant of the fact that I don't want to infringe upon the private life of corporations and other entities in Canada. So there's always a fine line. Is it something that we can look at? Do we want to strengthen it up to the point where we hold people accountable once they leave public office? I'm not averse to those kind of suggestions, amendments, and changes as we go along. But clearly, we have a problem based on the reports we've seen from CSIS, from the RCMP, from our intelligence services, that we are being infiltrated at the highest levels in our institutions right now. So I think this would be the first step. And as we go along, we need to continue to be vigilant. As we also know, it doesn't address the influence that, of course, is cyber influence. And doesn't address the social web influence, which is very powerful. I think this is very concrete, it's very specific. It deals with entities that are affiliated with these totalitarian regimes that very often are here trying to influence our public institutions and also our public crown corporations as well in various other sectors.
Senator Wu.
Thank you, Senator Housakos, for drawing attention to my op-ed. And I encourage all of you to read it for yourself rather than to rely on the caricature that he has offered. Senator Housakos, you've been quite clear in saying that China is an authoritarian state, which I entirely agree with. You also describe it as tyrannical. I'm not sure I'd go that far, but it's certainly Leninist. And I think you said that really all entities in China are subject to the direct or indirect control of the Chinese state. So let me put my question in the reverse. Can you name some legally constituted entities in the People's Republic of China that would not fall under the definition of directly or indirectly controlled or influenced by the Chinese state, and therefore would not be subject to registration under this bill?
Senator Housakos.
Senator Wu, I can tell you your op-ed and your comments over the last little while have garnered enough attention without me having to draw any attention to them. Where we really fundamentally differ on this debate is that China is a tyrannical state. And it's unfortunate that a member of the upper chamber doesn't recognize that. Because we don't recognize what happened in Tiananmen Square as an accident. It was tyranny. What is going on to the Uyghur people is tyranny. And it's something that's recognized around the world, including our own parliament, and it's shameful that we didn't recognize it in this chamber. So to stand up and say that you take exception to the comments of me referring to the administration and the regime in China as tyrannical is in itself outrageous. United Front is just one example of an organization operating in Canada funded directly to uphold the principles of that tyrannical regime. Organizations like Huawei are state-funded, they're international multinationals, which have been recognized by organizations like CSIS, like the RCMP, in engaging in security espionage right here in our country. We've had these organizations, our security forces, tell parliamentary committees that we need to take action and do something about it. I find it outrageous that a parliamentarian questions the veracity of that information and questions the veracity of where we are vis-a-vis a democracy and the Republic of China.
Senator Wu.
From your non-answer that you consider all legally constituted entities in China to be subject to the direct or indirect control of the Chinese state, in which case I ask you, why would we then not register a cultural organization registered in China that wants to promote cultural ties with Canada and through its agent here in Toronto or Montreal wants to speak with me, for example, about having a concert in Calgary or some other city? Why would somebody representing that institution, an institution in China, in a tyrannical state, subject to the direct or indirect control of the party, why would that person not be registered and perhaps punished if he or she were to speak to not just me, but to any of us in here, including, of course, our colleagues who support the arts, and we heard about the motion to give more attention to the importance of the arts in this country. Why would that cultural institution not be covered under the registry?
Senator Housakos.
You're using an extreme case, Senator Wu. Number one, we're not talking about holding accountable people who are promoting cultural exchanges. And I can tell you this, the Chinese community in Canada does not need any help from the Chinese Republic in order to promote Chinese culture and Canadian Chinese culture. They can do it on their own very well. So that is not at all the essence of this bill. The essence of this bill is very simple. When you have organizations that are funded directly by Beijing, that are here promoting the agenda of that tyrannical organization to government agencies, to our institutions, particularly in commerce, in trade, in science, technology, in energy sectors, those are the ones that are of our serious concern when it comes to dealing with this issue, Senator Wu. So trying to muddy the waters and trying to justify the unjustifiable just it isn't right, isn't appropriate.
Well, if I could then follow up again. Your non-answer would seem to suggest that the cultural organization would in fact be covered under the registration, under the registry, which you said it would not in your speech. And presumably other organizations, because they're also under state direct or indirect control, such as, I don't know, alumni associations, sporting groups, municipalities, again under the direct or indirect control of the state, would have to be registered if an individual representing that entity were to speak to a parliamentarian or indeed with a senior official. In that situation, where essentially every legally constituted entity in the People's Republic of China would have to be registered under this act, would you not say that the assertion of the two authors in that op-ed that the circulated text messages and WeChat posts saying that many, many entities and individuals associated with China would be targeted under Mr. Chiu's failed bill, would you not agree then that that information was actually accurate?
Senator Housakos.
Senator Wu, my answer is very, very clear. If you have any organizations funded by Beijing who are active in Canadian soil, are going to be obligated to register. Absolutely. That's what this bill is saying. I don't find, I'm not disagreeing with it, and that's really the objective of the bill at the end of the day. But it doesn't target Canadian Chinese cultural organizations that are active on Canadian soil. And my point is exactly that. We do not need Beijing and their money in order to be infiltrating Canadian Chinese cultural organizations. That's precisely part of the point and part of this exercise we're going through. Beijing should be worrying about promoting their own cultural activities at home, as we are preoccupied with promoting our own cultural and multicultural activities in Canada with our Canadian citizenry. That's really the objective of this bill. So I don't see where you're lacking an answer to your question here.
Senator Wu.
Let me put it even more directly then. Would you consider that any Canadian, whether a recent immigrant from China or anywhere else, representing any Chinese organization or institution, a school, a municipality, a badminton club, a mahjong association, all sanctioned in China, legally sanctioned, presumably under the direct or indirect control of the state, any individual representing that entity in China wanting to speak to a parliamentarian or senior official, would that person be covered under your bill? Under Mr. Chiu's bill, he would. Would that person be covered under your bill and be required to register?
Senator Housakos.
Any entity that is connected to this tyrannical regime in Beijing would be covered. Yes, the answer is yes. I'm not hiding from that reality. If you have an institution, a Chinese state-owned and operated institution in Canada, yes, it would fall under this bill, as it should.
Senator Housakos, as I see more senator rising. You have, as acting leader, unlimited time. Do you wish to continue to answer question?
Absolutely.
Senator Wu.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Housakos. Would you take a question? Thank you. You know, regarding you talk about Kenny Chu, MP Kenny Chu, I think there's a lot of misinformation. I would like to correct it. As I know Kenny Chu well, and I flew to Vancouver to support him on the election. After elected, you know, I saw he was going berserk, going in a different way, acted that he is a Minister of Foreign Affairs. I told Kenny Chu, I said, Kenny, you have to work for your community, constituent. You are elected by Canadian, and you are supposed to work for Canadian and not foreign affairs. And I warned him many times, including the interim who worked for me, went to help him, and I told him to carry the message to Vancouver. I say, now you are claiming that you have Chinese agent influence that sabotage you. I say that's not true. Meng Wanzhou, Madam Meng Wanzhou was arrested in Vancouver by the government. You would stand a good chance to be re-elected, but he chose to jump to a different way. And I won him finally, you know. So what happened to the result? Yes.
Question. Do you have a question for Senator Housakos?
Yes, Senator Housakos, you know, I do not know, did you talk to Kenny Chu about what is the truth that happened to him?
Yes, I did.
Senator Dunn? Senator Ho?
I mean, he's lying to you. Thank you.
Senator Duncan?
Your Honor, I move the adjournment of this debate to the next sitting of the Senate.
L'honorable Sénatrice Duncan.
It is moved by Honorable Senator Duncan, seconded by Honorable Senator Petitclerc, that the debate be adjourned until the next sitting of the Senate. If you oppose, please say no. Carried.